Okay, hello everybody. Thank you very much, Anna, for the warm welcome. It's very nice to be here again, and thank you all very much for coming to this session, which I hope you will find to be interesting. I'm going to ask you to conduct a few tasks, and that's why I've asked you to have a pen and a piece of paper. So it's audience participation time. I hope you'll enjoy doing that. Just to start off with, though, does anybody know how many words that somebody would need to know to be able to operate at a basic level in English? 300. Yes? Any advance on 300? Possibility? Mm-hmm. The experts who've studied this and done research on this talk about around 1,200 words as the sort of amount of words that you need to be able to operate at a minimum level in English, and probably in other European languages would be similar. Now, that just gives you the idea that obviously the memory is important, because you can't hold 1,200 words in your head simultaneously. There's also important to make a distinction between words that we recognize. So if we see the word, we say, oh, we've seen that before, and then other words that we can actually produce. So when we're talking about language learning, we can talk about words that we can recognize, and so when you're reading, you can see on the page a word, and then there are other words which you can produce, you can actually use productively for communicative purposes in speech and in writing. Do you have a question? Yes.
Yes. Are you counting I and me as the same word here, for example, or are you counting them as different words, stuff like that?
I would count them as different words, yeah, that's fine. Okay.
Same with they and them and so on.
Yes, that's right, yeah. So, as you may know, some words in English are what we call high-frequency words, words like I. If you counted a text, you would see that I is used quite frequently, where other words are less frequent. And obviously, we know a lot of the frequent words, but fewer of the less frequent ones. So, is anybody here good at maths? Oh, no, I'm not. Okay, so I'm not going to ask for any volunteers then. I'd like you to just do a bit of mental arithmetic for a minute. I'd like you to imagine that, I'd like you to try and calculate. So 3 multiplied by 12 you would know as 36, yeah? How about, though, if I said to you 3 multiplied by 12 and you add 10 and then you subtract 4, what would you get? 42, thank you. You're good at maths. Well done. Okay, now in order to create that calculation, you had to keep the numbers in your head for long enough to be able to get to the end point, which was to realize the task. What I'm just trying to illustrate to you there is the importance of memory in this case. Now, when we were at school, did you ever come across the 2 times table? Don't say no. Yes. Please say yes. Presumably you did. And I spent a long time when I was at school learning this table and being asked to recite it aloud to the teacher. And this was a very common method at the time of learning, simple mathematical calculations, 2 3s are 6, etc. A particular way of learning, what is commonly called as rote learning. So you actually try to memorize every combination of the figures. But you couldn't do that with a language. You imagine trying to memorize in a particular way the whole of a dictionary. I mean, how many words are there in the dictionary? Thousands of words, presumably. We just wouldn't be able to do it. So we need to have other techniques. So what we're going to be doing a bit later on is to look at some other techniques that we can use to get information into our heads. Before we do that, though, I'm going to now give you an activity. Has anybody driven abroad? Have you taken your car or hired a car and driven abroad? Some people are saying yes, yeah, okay. Has anybody driven in the UK? You have to be quite brave because we drive on the other side of the road. But if you are planning to drive in the UK in the future, you will need to know some of the road signs that I'm going to show you in a minute. And what I would like you to do is not do any writing, please. I would like you to look at the screen and just see what you can memorize. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds to have a look at these road signs. And in that time, I want you to see if you can try and memorize those signs. So let's have a go. Could you now write down what you remember? So you may like to just compare with the person next to you. So what did you remember? If you have a look at the screen, you can check if you've got some of those signs. How did you get on? Easy? No? So what was difficult possibly about that task?
There are no special relationships between the signals.
Yes?
We can pick them like groups or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yes, that's a very good point. Yes. Okay.
They're quite low frequency words.
Mm-hmm.
Specific information.
Yes. Yeah. So, for example, which sign would you say is less common?
Adverse camber.
Yes. Do we know what an adverse camber is? Does anybody know? It's just the way that the shape of the road is different to what it should be. So it's warning you of that. So the fact that, yes, the relationship with the information is not very clear, the type of information is not very common. And what else, what other problems did you have? Yes, information overload. Yeah, if you're presented with too much information at once, and in this case, very little time, it's quite difficult to put it into your head, isn't it? Yeah. So it's important to be aware of these things, because if you are setting yourself your own study task, don't give yourself an impossible task like that, because you're less likely to be successful at it. Okay, I'd like you to try again now. So, we're going to have another 30 seconds. No writing, please. I'd like you just to try to remember the following signs on the screen. Okay, so if you'd like to just write down what you remember for that. So would anybody like to tell us what was the first sign on the top left?
Try your brakes.
Yes. Okay, and the next one?
Slow lorries for 2 miles.
And the final one?
Dual carriageway.
Yep. Okay. So how was that? Easy. Yeah? Easier? Anybody would like to compare the first task with all of the signs and then those 3? Why was this easier for you?
Less information
Yes.
to copy.
Signal has different form and different colors.
That's right. Yeah. So you could see, picture in your mind a contrast between colours and position, which is very important, isn't it? Stimulating our visual memory there. Yes? Anything else?
The shape of the signal.
Yes? Why would that be helpful to you in remembering the signs?
So the triangle signal is avoiding you, and the following signal and the column as well, and they're shaping.
Yes, that's right, yeah. So, for example, with the red triangle, which is saying try your brakes, you might imagine that that is symbolizing a mountain, and when you go down a mountain, you need to apply the brakes, and if you don't, you're going to have an accident, and that's why the red is there. So by putting that information together, that might help you to remember that particular sign, for example. Lorries tend to be rectangular. And that's why that sign, well, it's not the reason, but that sign is rectangular. So by putting that again together, and if you imagined a lot of rectangular lorries in front of you for 2 miles, which is a long distance, you'd have to go slowly. So making those connections might help you to remember that particular sign. I don't have a good explanation for dual carriageway ahead, but hopefully. Yes. Okay, good. So, just a brief introduction there for you. What I want to do this morning is to look briefly, give a brief explanation about how our memories work. And then after that, focus more on some techniques which we can apply for language learning. So, to start off with, if we, for example, we light a match and we see a lighted match in front of us, we can listen to the sound of the crackling as it burns. We can smell, as it's burning. We can see the color of the flame. And if we put our hand close to it, we can feel the heat. So what we're doing here is we're perceiving that what we're seeing in this case is a flame. And that helps us to understand and recognize it. And maybe when you were a small child, for example, at some point you went and touched, as most of us did, a flame for the first time. We'll always remember that because of the sensation that we had. All of that information helps us to process that information, but also to store it in our brains. So that's very important. So our sensory memories are very important for any sort of processing that we're doing. Now, people probably say to you, you may have heard that people say, I never forget a face. Some people say, I can always remember a face I've seen. Other people might say to you, I can always remember faces, but I can't remember the names of the people. Many of us might think of that, for example. I would like you to see if you can identify the two people on the screen. Do we know those people? Yeah. Yeah. So we know those people because we've spent a lot of time looking at them. And we don't have to think, oh, who is the person on the left and who's the one on the right? Yeah. We have an amazing memory for visual information, particular faces. You know, we can recognize, you know, if we've seen a person, you know, a few times, we can recall that. So our visual store of information, whether it's for faces or for other things, is a very powerful part of our memory. And one of the recommendations is that we use that when we are trying to learn new items of language. So relate, for example, a particular word or phrase to a mental picture, and we'll look at some of the information a bit later on. But in addition, for technical reasons, I wasn't able to play you a clip, but I will show you the lyrics. But most of us, if you listen to the beginning of a song, you can immediately recognize where it's come from. Similarly, if you have a machine, for example, if you've got your car, for example, you start it in the morning, you know immediately it's not running correctly, don't you? If you hear a very different sound, it's incredible how our brain registers the normal rhythm of a machine, whether it's, you know, that projector, our car, our washing machine, and we know immediately that it's gone wrong. The problem is we don't know what's wrong with it. We don't, you know, it'd be great if we immediately could recognize, well, the problem is that, you know, that there's a piece that's not quite aligned correctly. So we have a very strong auditory store in our minds. And those are just the lyrics of the song, current song, Stay With Me by Sam Smith, which you'll probably know. And, you know, by listening to that song or just a few of the lyrics, you'll recall it if you've heard it before, for sake of argument. So thinking about how the process works, I'd like you to imagine that you've gone to the market to do some shopping and you come across this particular fruit, a loganberry. Does anybody know a loganberry? Can you buy a loganberry here in Madrid? Yes. So it would be quite an unusual fruit. So imagine you're coming into the market and you see there's a loganberry. Now, you might look at it and you think, that's not interesting, and walk past. What you will do then is it will be quite difficult for you to remember that you even saw that fruit. If you don't spend any time looking at it, you'll probably forget it. So normally, information that we don't attend to, we don't spend any time on, we forget. Because our minds are selective, isn't it? Yeah? I mean, the typical example of that is if you're distracted as you're driving or getting on the bus or whatever, you don't look at all of the buildings as you're sitting on the bus passing. You'll only remember some of them because you haven't been attending to them. So if we don't pay attention to something, we'll forget it. That's the first thing. The next step then is going back to the example of the loganberry, is that you see this fruit and you think, oh, this looks interesting. I don't know what that is. So you'll go over to the shopkeeper or the market stall holder and you'll say to them, what is this fruit? What's it called? And they'll say it's a loganberry. And you say, oh, that's very interesting. Now, you may not do anything else, but you've retained that image of that fruit for long enough to be able to go and ask, what is it? But in order to remember what a loganberry is in the future, you need to do a bit more. So you need to start looking at it. You say, well, this fruit, it's similar to a raspberry. It's also similar to a blackberry. And if you know that the origin of a loganberry is because a raspberry and a blackberry were crossed together, and so it's it's come from that. It was originally discovered by a man called Logan. Surprise, surprise, yeah. James Logan in the late 1880s in California. And he did some experiments and he accidentally produced this type of fruit. And since then, that's been propagated, you know, it's been distributed in many places. So by going into, you know, the texture, maybe even trying it, all of those things, if you try the fruit particularly, because you will be stimulating your taste, that will also help you to remember it. So if you eat that fruit in the future, you'll say, oh yes, I recognize that. And you may even remember the particular market or place where you tried it for the first time. So all of that process would help you to remember that piece of information, and it would help you to retrieve it in the future. So if somebody asks you what is a Loganberry, then you would be able to say that it is a cross between a raspberry and a blackberry. It was originally, you know, created in California in the 1880s. You wouldn't normally do that for most fruits, but in this case it might be helpful. So we can hold information in what's called our working memory, or sometimes called short-term memory, for a period of time. But there's only a limit to how much information we can hold, and then the brain discards it. So we need to work harder to store it away. And with language learning, we need enough information to be able to communicate at a particular time. So if I say to you, how are you today? You need to be able to respond with an appropriate response. Now, you will either immediately be able to do that, or you'll have to think, what is the appropriate response to that? So in order to complete a task, you need to have enough information in your head to complete that task, and you may have to bring that from your long-term memory. So that's a little bit about the actual process. Let's look at some particular tasks which will illustrate a little bit more about memory. I'm going to give you 30 seconds again to try, no writing please, try to memorize this information. Okay. If you could try to write down the top line. This is not an exam, so you can check with the person next to you. Can confer if you'd like to. How was that? Easy? Okay, let's have a check. So that was the top line. Yeah. So any thoughts about that? On a scale of it was very difficult to very easy, where would we put that?
Extremely difficult.
Extremely difficult. Well, the first line, the top line, that was easy for you, okay? Yeah, but you didn't know that in advance, did you? You didn't know you had to do the top line in advance, did you?
Because usually
Right,
So
okay.
you read it, the first line first, then the second line. So
Yeah,
if you start to repeat it, the repetition,
right.
this line is the one you're gonna repeat more, so it's the easier to learn.
Yes, okay, yeah. Any other thoughts about how easy, difficult it was?
I think without a technique it would be quite difficult.
Yeah.
And it depends on whether you naturally tend to read in rows and columns.
Yeah. Yes, okay. So the thoughts, the reason for giving you this task is to just draw your attention to the features. For a start, the information is not organized in any particular way, which makes it more challenging. Also, you didn't have a reason for doing it, which is very important. It's much more difficult to do things if you don't know why you're doing it. And there's also you've got a mixture of letters and numbers, which is also complicated. So if information is ordered in some way, it is easier. Okay, let's move on and look at the second one. So we've got another 30 seconds to try this one. And I'd like you to try for these 3 lists of items to try to memorize these 3 lists of items. Okay, if you can write down what you remember for that one. How is that? Difficult? Yeah? Mm-hmm. Okay, let's have a look. Now, you may have found that the information on the right in red was the easiest because... That's right. Yes. Yeah. So in this case, this is just an example, as you can see, that information is easier to remember if it's meaningful. So there is some meaning in the list on the right, whereas the other lists are, the first list has very little meaning because they're not words. The middle list are decontextualized, just jumbled words, quite difficult to remember. So that is a very important principle, not only for language learning, but for any subject. The organization of information is essential. And particularly with language learning, often you're expected to, undertake exercises which have no communicative or no particular purpose. And it's very difficult, or to learn words. I mean, I'm astounded sometimes when I'm traveling and I pick up the foreign or the English language newspaper of that particular place. And there's normally a section for learning English, for example. And there are exercises which are either translating, translation exercises or fill in the gap. And the words, the phrases that are being presented may sound very good in the local language, but they're not necessarily very, as we were talking about, frequent, items. And that makes it very difficult to learn, lists of words which you don't really have much of a purpose for. You don't know how they're going to be used. So if you're organizing your own vocabulary learning, it's important to give it some meaning and make it that you can understand. So one technique which works quite successfully is to organize information thematically around a particular topic. So if we're thinking about trees, it's a good idea to try and picture or relate the picture to the particular word. So in this case, this, as you probably know, is a pine tree. And by identifying what a pine tree is and what it's not will give you some information and help you to remember it. So you can, for example, you can obviously look at the general characteristics of trees. So below the ground level you have the roots, and then you can imagine the trunk, and then you have the branches, and then you have the leaves. But pine trees don't have leaves, they have needles, and then they have cones. So in order to differentiate a pine tree from another type of tree, such as an oak tree or a beech tree, you could identify that it has needles rather than leaves. So that would help you to hopefully remember what a pine tree, or at least recognize it if you saw it. So if you're storing language, it's easier if you can relate it to similar information. So for example, you've got your central idea of a tree, and around that you can add other types of tree. So on the left-hand side you have coniferous trees, so trees which don't lose their leaves, and on the right you have deciduous trees, trees which do leave their leaves. So that would be one way of organizing the information. And relating, for example, to the picture, that having a mental image would be helpful to you. And you can do that for, obviously, for other things. That's just one example. So we need to think about our memory, our minds, as a big store, like a library. You know, we don't really understand how much information we have there. The problem we have is accessing that information. So in any good library, you should be able to identify what you're looking for and go straight to the resource and find it easily. And similarly, within our memories, we should be able to store that information, and by doing that, we can categorize it. So if, for example, we want to store the information about trees, we have the label trees, and then we have, for example, coniferous trees, and a pine tree is a coniferous tree. So that would give us some sort of categorization. So to be able to recall that information, if somebody said to us, can you tell us a type of coniferous tree, you can then say a pine tree, because you can recall that information. So it's about categorizing that information in your mind. So if you imagine that that is your mind, and each piece of information is a book or some information in a page in a book, you can easily go to that to find it. And what we need to do is to work on strategies so that we are better at doing that. And it's an ongoing process in our daily lives. We need to do these things. Now, in order to get information, to recall the information, so to bring that from our memories, it's important to have what they call as cues. So we have particular information which helps us to remember things. Now, can you remember what you had for lunch yesterday? Right. Can you remember what you had for lunch the day before? And do you remember what you had for lunch last Friday? But you do remember the lunch you had at the Ritz Hotel, don't you? So, for example, if you've had a fancy lunch at the Ritz Hotel or somewhere like that, you're not going to have any problem in remembering what you ate. I don't know what I had for lunch yesterday. I certainly have no idea what I ate last Friday, but I do remember what I ate. Or, for example, This is me showing off now. This is a notepad from the Ritz Hotel in Moscow. I'm afraid I don't have one for the one in Madrid. I went to a trade fair on 2 occasions in this hotel. And on one of the occasions, I went down to have a cup of coffee because I was too early, you know, I was trying to kill some time. So I went down to have some coffee. It was the most expensive coffee I've ever had. It cost me about 10 euros. But it was wonderful. You know, gold and you know, carpet that thick and, you know, a beautiful service. So if somebody says to me the Ritz, I can immediately recall not only the coffee I had, but I can recall the surroundings. So that, for me, is the cue of bringing from my long-term memory. And that's what you want to try to do, isn't it? We need to have these triggers to help us to recall some information. So we can use events. We can use particular thoughts. So if somebody says something to you which is controversial, that will stimulate information which you have stored, and that will stimulate a response. You can use pictures, sounds, you know. You have, again, an amazing store of auditory information, and smells. It's incredible. You know, you walk, how many times have you walked into a place and just the smell of it reminds you of somewhere you've previously been, you know. So that is a very strong thing. I'm not for language learning. If you can try and recreate or the smell of something with the words, if you're learning, you know, smelly things which have a smell, that's a good way of remembering them because our, you know, our olfactory memory is quite strong as well. So, I have another task for you now. I'd like you for 30 seconds to focus on this picture and pay special attention to its features. No writing, please. Okay, if you could write down what you remember. Okay, I'd now like you to work with somebody else and try and answer these questions about the picture. Okay, thank you. Could I have a volunteer at the back? What time was the time on the clock? 1 o'clock. Okay, it was just after 12, just after midnight. You're near close though, well done. What was the man on the horse carrying in his hand? Yeah. Okay, yeah. And was there any other person in the picture? Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, he was wearing a white shirt leaning out of an upstairs window in the house. And what time of day was it? Yes, okay. So it's just after midnight, yeah. And how do you know? There was the clock and? Yeah. There was a full moon and the horse's shadow was reflected on the road. Yeah. Okay. So that is just an illustration of how much, obviously, the longer we look at something, the more time, the more information we can take in. Probably most of us could get in a short period of time the main features from that picture. But you'd obviously have to study it very carefully in order to pick up all of the specific details. And obviously, the more you studied it, the more information you could get. So paying attention is very important as a technique for our memories, as we've said. How many times when we meet somebody do we meet them, but we forget their names because we don't listen to the name when we've said it because we're a bit anxious about the situation, we don't pay enough attention, etc. That's a very common situation. But obviously, if you're trying to memorize something, it's important to be relaxed, not stressed, and to spend enough time on trying to learn it, and at the same time trying to organize the information that you have. So that's important. And a more serious example of that is how many of you have taken, as I have, a fire safety course? Anybody? No? Yeah, possibly. Yeah. I, for my work, am required to take a fire safety course every year, and not a physical one, but an online questionnaire type thing. And you're asked all the different types of fire extinguisher and what fire extinguishers is relevant for most fires. Now, I would imagine that most of us don't even know where the fire extinguisher is, let alone which one to use. Where I work, we're told, don't even tackle the fire, just ring the security office and run out screaming. So that's what we're supposed to do. But I always remember that foam is for tackling flammable liquid fires, because when I was very small, I was very, very small, but I remember that was a truck carrying glue, and it caught alight at the end of my street. And it was like a disaster movie. I mean, Bruce Willis was coming out here, he should have been there, because the fire was, there was glue, a light running down the road, and the fireman had to spray the whole area with foam to put it out. So that always stuck in my mind, that image of that burnt out lorry and the remnants of the foam. So that helps me to remember that foam is useful for that type of fire, as well as some other things. So we're going to move on to another task, which is related to vocabulary learning. And I'd like you to have a look at these words and see how many words you can memorize in 30 seconds with no writing, please. So you have 3 lists. If you'd like to write down what you can remember. If you'd like to compare with the person next to you, or somebody else. Okay, so those are the words again. How did you get on with that? Okay, yeah. Did everybody get the 3 lists? Yeah. Which lists were easier for you? The first one. Okay, second one, yeah. Okay. The researchers, one of the reasons I put this is researchers have found that if you are learning a series of vocabulary items which are similar in the way that they are said, so the first list, cap, map, mat, man, etc., which sound very similar, that's more difficult to remember than the second list, which is phonologically more different, yeah? Cow, pit, few, hot, bar, etc., yeah? So that is a useful thing to know in terms of, again, if you're making your own vocabulary list, very similar items. It's a bit like if you're trying to spell, you know, your name and address. If you've got similar letters, the chances of a mistake are probably higher than if they're very different. Or if you're trying to remember a series of numbers, you know, 5 ones, 111 or whatever it is more difficult to necessarily remember as a long series than just 1 or 2 items, for example. So let's focus on the third list as our... Yeah.
Then alphabetical lists aren't necessarily a good idea.
Not necessarily. If they're, you know, if you tried to learn all the A's from a, you know, a dictionary for sake of on, yes, that could be quite difficult, I think, yeah. So if we could focus on the third list of items, imagine that we are going to try and learn those words. Can anybody give me an example of what technique could you use to try and cement into your memory those 5 words in the third list? Yeah, good. Yeah, okay. So that would be a very perfect... You've seen the next slide, haven't you? You have, haven't you? So, there you are. Well done. So, you could take the first letter of each of those words, and it doesn't make a proper word, but it sounds like a word, solst. That's quite easy to remember. And then you recall that, and by recalling that will help you to remember those key words. And then if you make up a little story, as you can see, so there was a strong smell in the hallway when an old man came back from the bank late one afternoon. He went to the safe in his office, opened it and took out a thin envelope containing some money. So a little story like that would help you to remember those particular words. And if you can sort of try and imagine that hallway and the smell that it would have, that might help you to recall that. You might also think about why he'd been to the bank. Why was he going to the safe to take out money if he'd just been to the bank, for example? That may help you to remember it. So story methods of learning vocabulary are quite strong, quite a good idea. Another possibility is to learn the opposites. So, for example, in this case, strong and weak, old and young, late and early. Now, in this case, I'm using the adjective safe and dangerous and thin and fat, for example. So that might be easier to create a mental image. You might be able to remember synonyms, yeah? So words which are similar for some of those things as another possibility. So let's just go on to that. Another possibility, though, is if you have to recall, because often we need to know these words, but we don't have to come up with a list straight away. We want to know the word strong and old, but we don't need to come up with them in that particular order. So the next technique we're going to practice now is useful if you have to know a series of items in a particular order. In this case. So I'd like you to imagine a room in your house, a one that you're comfortable with, your bedroom, your living room, your kitchen, for example, and I'd like you to identify 5 places or places within that room. So either places or objects. So if it was this room, for example, the screen, the table, the chair, etc., the window, 5 places. Can you do that? And now I'd like you to place each of those words on one of the words on the place in the room. So go around the room and I'd like you to take the word strong and place it on your first place. And then take the second word old and place it on the second place. Go around the room doing that. Okay, so you should have in your mind a room like this, and within that room you have a number of locations which you're familiar with. So I go into the room and I want to now retrieve those vocabulary items. I have now put the word strong on the chair, the word old on the television, late on the fireplace, thin on the sofa, and safe on the picture. So by walking around the room, I picture in my mind where are the items, I go to the chair and I can see the word strong or whatever the information is. And that way I can retrieve those items and I can see the order. And if I particularly are having difficulty in remembering the items, I can say, for example, the television is very old, and I can imagine that an old television, for example, and that might help me to retrieve that information. So this technique, or the place method technique, is a very useful technique for storing information in a particular sequence. And if you have a shopping list, I don't know if anybody uses this, but you know, a shopping list, you can use this technique. Does anybody use that? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Another thing particularly important when you're learning languages to go on holiday is the idea of association. Now, as you can see, as you know, the word for telephone in Spanish is not very different to that in English. But when I lived in Finland many years ago, I soon discovered that the word for telephone in Finnish was very different. Does anybody know what that is? It is puhelin. Now, that doesn't have any similarity. And one of the difficulties is when you're learning a different language is to find points of similarity. And so in this case, it's a question of making association between the word, in this case, puhelin, with telephone. And I always personally struggled with that. Similarly, when I lived in Wales, the word for phone in Welsh is rifon. Now that has some similarity with telephone, but again, one has to make some sort of association. So it can be a bit more of a challenge. And again, visual techniques are a possibility. Does anybody know, there is another technique which is commonly used called a verbal mnemonic, which is making a rhyme out of some information. So if you particularly wanted to remember a date or a series of information, you can make a mnemonic out of it. Does anybody know what we say for the number of days that there are in each month of the year? Because some months in the year have fewer days, don't they? So what we can use is the mnemonic of this. 30 days have September, April, June and November. All the rest have 31, excepting February alone, which only has but 28 days clear and 29 in each leap year. And by remembering that mnemonic, that helps us to obviously recall that information and know that, you know, some years February has 28 days and other years it has 29 days, for example. And if you were lucky to come, that's a picture of Leeds, and it was a summer's evening like that, we have a mnemonic for that, which will tell you what the weather will be. Is that a good sign or not a good sign? It's supposed to be late afternoon, dusk, yeah. Anybody? Is it a good sign if you see that or not? What's the weather going to do the next day? It's going to be pouring rain? No.
Red clothes at night?
Yeah. So red sky at night, shepherd's delight. Red sky in morning, shepherd's warning. So that it's a bit of a it's not wholly accurate, but the idea being if you see a beautiful sky like that in the evening, it's going to be a good day the next day. So the shepherds will be very pleased. If it's like that in the morning, you're in for problems. It could be heavy rain, for example. So a verbal mnemonics are another technique you can use to, and the idea of nursery rhymes, we all remember nursery rhymes, etc. If you can make something rhyme, that also stimulates our auditory memory and can be a powerful technique. So by reading something at the same time as you're trying to memorize it is a very powerful technique and worth doing. Another important thing for language learning is to try to learn chunks of information rather than individual words. I think traditionally language teaching has spent a lot of time teaching, at the individual, the word or the small phrase rather than the whole things. So these examples are from the song, the clip from the Stay With Me. So he says, I'm not good at a one-night stand. So you could learn that, but you could also learn other related phrases. So I'm not good at a game of cards, and any other noun phrases like that, but also verb phrases. I'm not good at playing tennis, etc. But then you could look at the positive. But I'm very good at making money. I'm very good at ice skating, and all of the possibilities of that, for example. And then he says, oh, won't you stay with me? And you could you change that to, oh, won't you dine with me? Or won't you dance with me? So what you're doing there is you're learning a particular phrase and adding to it with other examples. So learning a chunk. And any particular functional language, if you go, for example, into a hotel and you say, I'd like to have a room. Do you have a room? How much is it? All of that type of functional language is fairly standard. Once you learn the set phrases, it's just a question of learning the different options. And that's how language is, isn't it? It's for specific situations. There are particular phrases we use, as well as obviously other types of language to explain terminology or emotions, etc. But those useful building blocks are easier to memorize if you can do it that way. So coming towards a conclusion, just to summarize the process, that our memory works because we identify something using our senses, and that helps us to process it, to put it into our working memory for long enough in order to perform a task. If we pay enough attention to it, we won't forget it. And if we, try to store it in particular ways by relating it to visual information, to auditory information, etc., that way we can store it more appropriately and then to retrieve it at a future date from our long-term memory. So we'll remember language better if we link what we already know with the new information. So if you take the example of the traffic signs we started off with looking at, it's easier to learn those signs if you can identify what you already know, or to transfer your knowledge of traffic signs here to the ones which are new to you. The example of the pine tree was showing that by creating a mental picture or relating a picture of something to the particular word, it's easier then to store that information and to recall it on a subsequent information. Also, it's important to think about new words or phrases. So if you come across a Loganberry, rather than just looking at it, trying to find out its characteristics, why it's different to a raspberry or blackberry, will help you to store that information. And elaborating on the details. So, for example, creating other possibilities rather than just saying, I want you to stay with me, I want you to dance with me, or other possibilities should help you to remember that phrase more effectively. So I've got another task for you. Final task. Are you ready? So if you could have a look at the screen and tell me what is new. Yep. Well done. Okay. And finally, does anybody remember the 5 words which we've looked at, which we used the story for? Yes? Okay, well done. So you've learnt some techniques, I hope, added to what you already know. I'm going to stop there, but I'm happy to take any questions. Anybody else? Thank you for your attention. Yes.
I just want to ask Rupert, are you someone who lectures at the University of Leeds?
I teach, yes, that's right.
What do you teach?
We're going to use the microphone.
Oh, yes.
For the video
Okay,
No worries. I hope it works.
Sorry, Rupert.
yes, okay.
So I just wanted to ask, what do you teach at the University of Leeds?
English for academic purposes, so helping students to prepare for degree program study skills.
Okay, I found this is one of the best talks I've been to actually on learning vocabulary. I wanted to ask about learning syntactic structures.
Right.
Is there any techniques you have for that, or that you would recommend?
So particular grammatical structures, for example. I think that would be less to do with memorization. You probably wouldn't be expected to remember syntactic structures, so actual grammatical strategies. I think as much as anything it would be practice. I mean, one of the techniques that we try to use with the students what we teach, and I'm sure you do here, is to look at real examples of language. So to try and isolate from a text the particular structure and then to see how it's used in different contexts. and the whole, for example, in applied linguistics, the whole idea about concordancing. So computers can search a whole body of text, and from that you can isolate a number of occurrences of the structure is a very powerful technique. So I would use those sort of techniques to learn that sort of structures.
Okay, now that you mentioned that, actually, there is a website, Lingui, does
Yes.
that. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
More questions?
But I just have a comment. As far as Spanish students are concerned, it's not only important for them to remember the word, but
Yes.
to actually know how to pronounce the word.
That's right.
Because when you wrote down the word Loganbury,
Yes.
I hadn't seen it before, and I had to transcribe it so
Yes.
so as to remember how to pronounce it. So I always include a little bit of phonetic transcription
Yes.
in my classes.
Yes.
So to improve, also not only to improve their pronunciation, but also to connect the actual word with what they will eventually have to remember, which is the spelling,
Yes.
as well as the right pronunciation.
That's right. Yes.
That's just a comment.
Yeah, I think that's a very important additional piece of information, that when you look in the dictionary, you should be able to see the way to pronounce the word. And if you can write that down, and if possible, I mean, nowadays it's very easy with all of the, the stuff on the, online dictionaries to actually listen to the pronunciation of the word. That's very important. I mean, my own personal experience of that for learning other languages is that, if I, for example, going to China, as I went last year, I was trying to learn the particular pronunciation of some words, and I found it very difficult to do that because I didn't have access to that. So when I was actually in China, people couldn't understand me because I hadn't got, I might have been saying what was the correct word, but I hadn't got the pronunciation. So it's absolutely essential. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, what languages do you speak?
Only Spanish,
Okay.
only Spanish of any standard, yeah. But I can understand a bit of French, having studied it at school, and then I have to learn survival Japanese or Chinese or Arabic, but very, very basic. Yeah.
Okay.
But I wish I'd known all of this 30 years ago.
I find that knowing a language at survival level is a very good concept.
Yeah.
Any other question? I have a question.
Yes.
Can you give us some hope for prepositions?
Some hope.
Yes.
Yes. I don't know if there. I think there are so many aspects of grammar in any language that I think with prepositions it's a question of practice. Like a lot of, it's a question of starting with a few and then working from that. What is the difficulty with prepositions?
Oh, they have no meaning at all, except for, obviously they have meaning, but it is difficult to find a meaning to remember what preposition to use in each situation. So
Yeah.
maybe learning chunks can help.
Yes.
But I don't know if there are specific methods apart from reading a lot or listening a lot
Yeah.
of English for trying to find some sense and grasping the prepositions correctly.
I think, my experience of learning Spanish, I used to have huge difficulties with por and para, for example, that distinction which foreigners tend to have. And it's a question of trying to cement in, listening to, how people use those words and trying to fix that in your mind and building up from that. I personally found that. I don't think there's any sort of shortcut. There's no magic formula to this. But other people here might have some good advice. Go ahead.
If I can offer a comment. Yeah. When you're learning prepositions, another good thing to do is to have like a sentence with a preposition and then change the preposition and see how the meaning changes. That's a very good technique. And I used it a lot in German, for example, because in German it's not only learning the prepositions, but also learning which case goes with each and some of them can take 2, and the sentence changes depending on the case. So if you like write the sentence and you understand the meaning, and then you change the case, and you understand the meaning, it helps like to cement it. So it's the same as learning, for example, if something is in the fridge or on the fridge, or and so on. Take off, take on, to see how how one little word changes everything. It like really shocks the brain, I think, and that helps you learn.
But it's tricky, huh? Prepositions
Mm.
are
Oh
always
yes,
tricky.
definitely.
Always.
Can I just
In
add
every language.
to that? Because I teach English here, not here, but in Madrid. So periphrastic features like prepositions are a key feature of Germanic languages. So it's something we only share with a tiny language family. And I teach my students that all the prepositions and phrasal verbs have these key little extra meanings, and we do it by drawing pictures. So a good example is up. Up doesn't just mean a direction, it also means up to a limit and up to a level. And I think really you have to get comfortable with the idea that they have these tiny little extra senses, and really use those as a general rule, and then slowly refine the rule with experience, like with exposure to the language. But there are tricks. Yeah.
And you teach English where?
I teach at the British Council.
At the British Council.
One of the tips that you gave us to improve our English is to practice it.
Yes.
And one I've been doing the last couple of years is to read books or watch shows to improve my English, which was a really good tip until I get to professional and academic English, because it's not usual in the shows or in books.
Yeah.
So can you recommend me I prefer a book where, or some kind of author where I have these low frequency words to familiarize with it, because it's really hard to find.
Yeah. And what is your subject area?
No, I'm not about. I mean, it's not about engineering. It's about professional communication in, for example, in presentations,
Right,
in
yes.
speaking in companies,
Yes.
to companies. I mean,
Yeah.
this all this language have a lot of low frequency words
Yeah.
that when I started this subject, I realized I don't know. So,
Yeah.
do you know any book or?
I mean, there are some books on, for example, professional communication skills. I can't give you exactly the title of, a specific one, but if you go to a bookshop, there will be on certainly presentation skills and related generic skills, interview techniques, etc., negotiating, etc. But in addition, you should be able to find clips on the internet, about people in business meetings, those sorts of things. I mean, a lot of my early work when I worked here many years ago was with people in companies, teaching them those sort of skills one-to-one. So they are obviously very important. I mean, another thing you can do is to read some of the subject matter related to general management and business, because then you have a lot of items there. But again, it's like a lot of things, it requires exposure and practice, yeah? Example.
But all the examples you give me are for are not books with history. I mean, does it ring a bell to you? Any book with an argument and history, but in business level?
Yeah, I mean, the problem with certainly language teaching books, they're either very general, they say how to make a presentation, and they'll tell you presentation phrase, the sort of things that you would study on the communication modules here, or they are more generic. So in order to learn sort of terminology in any subject, you have to read the literature of that subject. So, general management books, marketing books, all those sort of things. It doesn't really exist. I mean, there are people who are writing you know, books English for aeronautical engineering. But again, that's probably not what you want to read. Yeah. So I think you have to address it by a mixture of getting into contact with real people, watching clips on the internet, and reading the subject matter from those areas. Yeah.
Okay.
If that helps. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any other question? No? So I think that I have to say again, thank you very much for being here. I think it has been a very interesting conference. And please, let's show Rupert that we like the conference very much.
Thank you.